Well, good morning, good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are in the world. Hello and welcome to the Saturday, the 28th of July edition of EV News Daily. It's Martyn Lee here with the news you need to know about electric cars and the move towards sustainable transports. And occasionally on a Saturday, I like to pause the news for a day and bring you an interview or a behind-the-scenes look at the world around electric transport. And today we're heading to AVID Technology, a British company specialising in electrified powertrain components. And I sat down for a chat with the founder and Managing Director Ryan Maughan. Now, Ryan founded the company back in 2004 and since then has led its growth and development. Ever since, AVID's now recognised as a leader in the field of electrification and heavy-duty vehicle electrification and hybridisation. On today's show, we both talk about the components you'll find inside your EVs and where they come from, why most large automakers are suddenly talking about electrification, the parts that go inside a Formula E car, how electrification reduces CO2, what's the optimal size of a battery pack, why Tesla are more agile than others, and what's the future of charging EVs. Well, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. I hope you're entertained by it as well. Ryan's a real expert. Been doing this a very long time, making the parts that go inside EVs. Let's take a listen.
Hi Martin, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for making time to have a chat to us. So a little brief introduction about AVID. I've kind of given it the one-line treatment, but tell us a little bit more maybe about where the company started and a little bit more overview to kind of set the table and everyone listening around the world to let them know what you do at AVID.
Yeah, okay, no problem. So AVID was established in 2004. We began properly in 2005. We've been involved in vehicle powertrain electrification since the beginning. So really, doing this a long time before it was fashionable. We spent a lot of time working with vehicle manufacturers, trying to convince them to look at electrification in the old days. And that allowed us to build up quite a decent portfolio of products and technology that you need for powertrain electrification. We've pretty much concentrated on heavy-duty vehicles, so trucks and buses and off-highway machinery. And we also were involved in quite a lot of very high-performance vehicles as well, so sort of supercars and hypercars and that kind of thing.
Wow, so you do everything from the commercial vehicles to super high technology. You started in 2004, though, and if you go back to, this sounds silly because it's actually not that long ago, that was 5 years before something like the Mitsubishi i-MiEV, to put that into perspective. That was 4 years before the Tesla Roadster was first delivered to customers in 2008. I mean, development only began on the Roadster at Tesla Motors in 2004. So you're going a long way back. What was the landscape like back then that made you want to found a company like this?
So I'd been working in the motorsport industry for about 10 years, building and running racing cars, which was... It's kind of all of the things that you think it is, plus an awful lot of hard work and sleepless nights. And literally one day, I kind of woke up and I just had this revelation of what on earth am I doing? And that with motorsport, we were sort of having an exciting time, but we weren't really making the planet a better place. My kind of conscience got the better of me. So I came home to the northeast, which is where I'm from originally, and I got a proper job, as my mum would like to say, working in a manufacturing company, leading sort of business development and things like that, and engineering. Through the course of that next sort of 3 or 4 years, I wanted to get back into the automotive industry and do something really positive. And the idea for AVID came about in that time. So using my kind of background in automotive and mixture of electronics and mechanical engineering, and we started doing some stuff. And it was clear to me, it seems strange now, because it's clear to everyone now. In 2004, it was clear to me that we had a huge problem. And in fact, our first company presentation, the very first slide had 2 pictures on it. And one was about climate change and one was about air quality. And at the time, I seriously got laughed out of a lot of meetings for kind of raising these 2 things as an issue. But it was clear to me that it was a huge issue, and there was a lot that needed to be done about it. And within that, there was a big opportunity to make a difference and build a great business. So that's kind of how it all started. So that sounds incredibly romantic and a bit over the top, but that genuinely is what happened.
When did you sense a change in the tide, if you like?
So for us, the first sort of few years of the business were very hard, but we managed to make some relationships with some good customers, and we were kind of keeping the lights on, keep moving forwards, developing some good standard technology for EV drivelines, hybrid drivelines, mild hybridisation, things like that. The big change for us, I think, was towards the back end of 2016. So still very, very recently. And it was a meeting with a customer, and they told us about their new strategy they were introducing. And this was a company that made conventional heavy-duty vehicles. And they had a new strategy, and it was all about redesigning their current vehicles to be electric powertrain first. And we left that meeting thinking, wow, that's a massive change, but it was a smaller manufacturer. It wasn't one of the big guys. Maybe everyone else isn't going to follow. But literally within a few weeks, we were in a meeting at a huge global manufacturer we'd been working with for a while on quite a small project. And they were telling us, new strategy, electrification of the vehicle powertrain, no more pure diesel platforms. And then the next day, we were in a meeting with another massive global vehicle manufacturer. They told us exactly the same thing. Massive change has been fairly recent, I would say, but 2016, last year, just 1 month after the next, so customers announcing major new programs for electrification, new hybrid vehicles coming out, new full EVs, and it becoming really a centerpiece of everyone's vehicle development strategy. So, electrification is now in the sort of top one or two things that most OEMs are working on. And typically the top two are electrification and automation. So that's the kind of two things that are keeping most execs at the big OEMs awake at night.
As much as you can, your life must be surrounded by non-disclosure agreements. Is there anything, for people listening to the podcast, is there anything that you can talk about now that's in the past, sort of recognisable names who you have worked with or supplied parts for, or are you really not allowed to talk about that?
Yeah, we have to be really careful because you're absolutely right. Our life is full of NDAs. But we've done some really exciting programs in the past. I think the one kind of takeaway about AVID, you'll find our products on almost every single hybrid or electric bus and truck made in Europe at the moment. That's the sort of top takeaway. So we deal with pretty much every single major bus and truck manufacturer, many further afield. In terms of big sort of notable names, we've got some really exciting customers. A lot of the cars in the Formula E use our components. A lot of the cars in sort of supercars that you were seeing rattling up and down the hill at Goodwood also have our components in. I think the biggest deal that we are able to talk about in the public domain was one that we announced a couple of months ago, which is a program with Jaguar Land Rover. So that's being supported by the Advanced Propulsion Centre. So there's a bit of UK government money going into that, and that means that we can talk about it to a certain extent. So we're working with Jaguar Land Rover, and we're developing a lot of components for their next generation hybrid vehicles. So that's a really exciting program for us.
So from your expert position and your point of view, it's very easy for idiots like me on a podcast to sit here and flippantly say we should all be driving full electric cars. Everything from the mildest of mild 48-volt hybrid systems, the kind of things that spin up turbos and pulleys and things that the engine would otherwise do to help increase that fuel economy, all the way through to where's your head currently at on the biggest opportunities, or what you would like to see people buying, or what you think the market is doing at the moment?
Yeah, so I like all electrification, and one of my sort of main things that really annoys me is people setting off, fuel cells versus electric vehicles. And we did a podcast on that topic just in itself a couple of weeks ago, and it came up again today. They're all electric vehicles. So a fuel cell vehicle is an electric vehicle, and it's got some advantages and some disadvantages. We do a lot of work with very simple electrification. So for trucks and buses and off-highway machines, there's an awful lot you can do with the electrification of the engine ancillaries, the thermal management system, and making a sort of mild hybrid package. And that's going to be really, really popular in the heavy-duty market over the next few years, and particularly with the new standards that have come in for CO2 reduction. So I don't have a problem with 48-volt mild hybrids. I think it's excellent technology, and it can make a really, really valuable real-world difference. One of the reasons in passenger car why these things haven't been in the market already for a long time, because the OEMs knew about electrified ancillaries 10 years ago, but the testing regime that existed with the NEDC driving cycle didn't really show a benefit, whereas the new testing in passenger vehicles with the WLTP and the RDE driving cycle shows a huge benefit with electrified ancillary systems. Electrified ancillaries and mild hybrids are fantastic. PHEVs, they've got a really important place in the market as well. The really interesting thing is that BEVs are improving so quickly that actually for most people, a BEV with a sort of 40 to 65 kilowatt hour battery pack, that does everything you need. So the i3 has a bit of a small battery, basically, depending on which model year it is. But if you look at a 65 kilowatt hour battery pack in a car, that's perfect, and there's a lot of those coming into the market in the next couple of years. So I think the next sort of 2 years we're going to see a massive change in thinking in terms of BEVs, because for a lot of cases people aren't doing huge mileage. You don't necessarily even need home charging. I think a friend of mine has a Renault Zoe and he doesn't have a charge point at home. He just charges on public infrastructure and manages perfectly fine with that. I like it all, and I think it's all good because it's all about electrification to get rid of emissions. So whatever you can do, if you can do something, it's better than doing nothing. And really sort of sitting back and not doing anything because you're not sure what the technology is going to be, I think is the wrong approach, because they all support each other. If you've got a full EV, you need electrified ancillaries. So why not develop really good electrified ancillaries for your internal combustion engine products? There's an awful lot of learning that goes across all the different platforms. So, and I think a lot of manufacturers are really realizing that now, and they're getting very stuck into all sorts of different electrification. It's the time where it's all happening right now.
Well, on that subject of the pace of change, because you work in this, you have a deep understanding of what's happened in the past, how quickly things are changing now. You have a deep understanding of supply chains and contracts being done. My favourite example, and it's an unfair example, and one day, goodness, I hope I never meet the chap because I keep picking on him on the podcast. It's the head of Daimler Trucks, Martyn Lee. And in February, when Elon Musk announced the Tesla Semi and said it's 500 miles range, then Martyn Lee came out and said if Tesla delivers on this promise, we'll buy 2 trucks, one to take apart to test because something has passed us by, and one to test drive. He said, I remember that quote, "For now, the same laws of physics apply." Here's someone who is massively in the know talking about somebody else who is massively in the know, and these two things are not lining up. It seems to be going at breakneck speed.
I think it is. I think that the problem that the situation you just described, there was another one today where someone was quoting the head of Lexus, who basically got all of his terminology wrong. And to me, I just think it's basically not acceptable. If you're in a senior position in a big car OEM, you should have a better grip in terms of where the state of the art is. And I think the guy from Daimler, they're not the most agile of businesses, and I think they know that. The pace of development, so Tesla are really interesting because they move a lot faster. They don't have any legacy of internal combustion engine. And that, it really is a real problem in the big OEMs where they've got years and years and years of experience with internal combustion engines. They've got whole departments. And the senior guys, they're not necessarily that close to what's happening on the ground floor. So they will be relying on what their sort of senior team around them are telling them. And if those guys are not people who've got experience in electrification and they just understand diesel engines and that's their point of view of the world, to be frank, they'll be getting the wrong advice at the moment. I think there's quite a lot of that in the legacy industry still to be overcome. Love them or hate them, that's Tesla's sort of ace card, is they don't carry that. They don't carry that legacy baggage. They've got their own issues and they've got other problems, but it does allow them, I think, to move a little bit more quickly, very focused, very clear vision of what they want to do. The automotive market it's quite a slow-moving market because essentially, trucks and cars are very complex engineered products, and if they go wrong, bad things can happen. So you've got to make sure that they work and they work properly under every single circumstance. Our expectations of the quality level of a car or a truck or an off-highway machine are incredibly high. So these engineering cycles, they're not months, they're measured in years. So it'll take between 3 and 5 years to introduce a completely new product. I think Tesla move a little bit more quickly than that. Maybe they can turn it around in 18 months. That's a ridiculously breakneck speed. So if you imagine, if you've got a new technology that's in the laboratory, and it works great, you've probably got a few years in the lab of refining it and improving it, and then you've got maybe 4 or 5 years of new product introduction process, commercializing it, scaling it up, and getting the vehicle that it's going to be built into launched in the market. So what you're seeing now is vehicles, and so battery technologies, for example. Batteries are coming into the market now that we knew about 10 years ago, but they're just becoming available commercially in high volumes now. So that you've always got to kind of bear that cycle in mind. So we can basically see what the technology looks like for about the next 5-6 years, and it looks really good.
On the subject of things like reliability and testing, so AVID Technology is business to business, not business to consumer. And the thing about Tesla is having Elon as that figurehead, and that's how much of a cult of personality that is around him as well. And I find many Tesla owners as well know that they are, in a way, beta testers when they have a piece of headlining that's rattling or something that isn't quite working, and they know that it'll get fixed if they take it back to the service centre, but it doesn't seem to bother them. But if VW start making 250, 500,000 cars out of some of their big factories, so as a supplier to those companies, you must be under a lot of scrutiny, pressure, just to ensure that your own quality control is right up there, because you can't be saying, oh yeah, this was cutting edge technology, we didn't quite get it right, never mind. The people you're selling your technology to, it absolutely must work first time, right?
Yeah, and we spend a huge amount of money and resources. You have a two-step process: design validation and then production validation. All of the products that we launch into the market go through very extensive design, development, validation programs, and these things, it takes a long time. Minimum length of time for us to launch a product is 18 months, and a lot of that is spent in doing accelerated life cycle testing, putting the components under conditions they would never actually really see in real life, but just to stress them out. A lot of our parts are going into commercial vehicles, which have to last for 50,000 hours. There's a lot of engineering goes into making that product robust and reliable, so it's going to survive under every possible imaginable condition. And we definitely we have some interesting times where we're doing kind of initial prototyping and early stage development, and you're working with parts that haven't quite been through that full validation process yet, and you can really see the difference in terms of how they perform.
Wow. Okay. I know I've already been longer than I said I would, but I've got two super quick questions to finish up. Just as we have an expert on the podcast today, the final two things I want to talk about. Firstly, charging, charge speeds, charge port connectors, things like charging at home. How fast will we ever end up charging at home? Are we limited by our own domestic housing supply, and how fast will we be charging our EVs when we're out on the road over the next few years? From your perspective of AVID Technology and things like charging technology, you're involved in that as well?
It's a funny one, that. So I think that people get overly obsessed with charge rates, and we're pushing for faster and faster charging all the time. But the reality is that if you look at the energy consumption of a typical EV per mile or per kilometre, it's very low, and how we use, particularly passenger vehicles, they're driven for a bit and then they're stationary for hours and then they're driven for a bit again. And fast charging is not actually really required for like 95% of what we do with the vehicle. 3 kilowatts charging gives you enough. 7 kilowatts perfect. So I think most homes, what needs to happen is most domestic homes need to have the ability to have 2 times 7 kilowatt charge points in them on the property, and then for on-street charging, 3 to 7 is enough for like 90%, and then very fast charging, it is required and it is helpful for some journeys in passenger vehicles, and it's more helpful for commercial vehicles, but you do start to run in all sorts of problems with grid capacity and infrastructure capacity. If you're trying to put 500 kilowatts into a battery, it's very challenging getting a grid connection that can deliver that. So what you're starting to see there, and I think there's actually a business model in this in itself. Tesla will start to do this linked to the truck, and they're the sort of perfect company in terms of what they've got across their business. You'll have fast charging stations for trucks with very high power delivery capability, but they will also have grid-connected battery systems, so they'll be able to work off a fairly low power grid connection and have some local battery storage at the charging station to kind of buffer, so then you can dump a lot of energy quickly into the truck, which can go on, and the battery will sort of charge up slowly again. I think there's a business model in that, because then you can also use those same batteries for doing localized grid stabilization, fast frequency response. So in providing power back onto the power grid in that local area, to help stabilize it, which is a business area all in itself. Or if you imagine something like an office complex or a hospital. Hospital is quite a good example. In a hospital, you're already going to have a backup generator set, or in a big office block or in any industrial building, you're going to have backup power in case the main grid fails. So people are replacing backup generating sets with backup battery packs. And again, if that's done properly, that can be linked into your recharging infrastructure to give you a bit more capacity for recharging locally and kind of tie it up to another service in the building. So there's a huge amount of work going on in that space at the moment, and a few different models. But I think the fundamental thing for passenger cars is actually 7 kilowatts is fine for the vast majority of what 90% of journeys require. If you're doing really long journeys and you're going to use fully deplete a 100 kilowatt hour battery in a with a few hours of driving, then you want to see a sort of 200 kilowatt or above charging capability. But I don't see it getting much above about 500 kilowatts. Even if we had bigger capacity batteries, it's more the practicality of if you're using 300 watt hours per mile, how many miles can you actually travel realistically before you as a person physically have to stop? That might change a little bit with more autonomous vehicles, but the person and their need to go to the bathroom or have a sandwich or a cup of coffee becomes the limitation. Where people tend to think is about we have to be able to fully recharge the battery at every stop, and that's you don't. You have to be able to put as much or slightly more energy back into the battery than you've just used getting to that point. So it's not necessarily a case of completely fully recharging a battery every time you hit a charger. The other problem that you face if you've got very fast, there's a lot of 50 kilowatt fast chargers at the moment. What happens with those is people leave their car on a 50 kilowatt charger for 2 hours. They're blocking the charger. Even on a 7 kilowatt charger, I see this all the time. I've got a plug-in hybrid, and you drive around trying to find a charge post, and all the charge posts are blocked because people in the city centre have parked their car on a 7 kilowatt post all day. And actually that's going to fill that, even a 40 kilowatt hour battery, if it was fully empty, that's going to fill that battery within sort of 4 hours. So those charge points where people are going to be parked for a long time could actually do with being lower power.
That's fascinating. That's an interesting take on it. And you answered my question was going to be about storage as well, so you read my mind. And you asked an interesting point on changing habits as well. Depending on what psychology book you read, it might be 21 days or 66 days, but we've had 100 years of developing a habit of going to a certain place to fuel a car, and lots of people think, let's go somewhere to put energy into our personal transport, and that's going to be a whole shift of habit, and that's going to be for some easy and for some slightly more difficult, and certainly interesting to watch the investments that the oil industry are making. They've got all this land and they've got all these forecourts, and they're certainly going to be, as they have been, Shell and BP investing in charge providers, hoping that we'll go to their forecourt to charge up our EV, but we'll wait and see how that plays out. They've got the money to back up, to back it up, but I'm just not convinced it's going to be a habit that we necessarily have to force ourselves.
No, because as you know, it's a passive process. It's a passive process now, so it's you're not standing there with your fingers on the trigger, putting fuel into the vehicle. You spend like 2 seconds, click, plug in, and then you walk off, and that's it, done. And it is very different. We were involved in an early project, the first Nissan Leafs that came into the country. We were involved in a project that looked at how they were used and how people would use them. We had some of our vehicles, and there were some Leafs and some Peugeot Ion, which was a Mitsubishi i-MiEV. And it was fascinating seeing how driver behaviour changed in a fairly short space of time with the charging habits, how people went from being very conscious about plugging it in every time they saw a charge point, then it sort of dropped down to maybe only every 3 or 4 days they'd plug the vehicle in. And I think there's some similar information from Tesla in terms of the frequency of how of their high capacity, the supercharger network is used. People will go from basically every time they see one plugging in to a much lower frequency of plugging in. Because it is such a passive process, the time it takes is not as critical as the time it takes to refuel your car with petrol.
Wow. All good stuff to think about. Thank you so much for your time on the podcast today. It's been way longer than I thought we would need, but it's just fascinating to have an expert on and to hear your take on it. I've been doing it for 14 years in this industry, so thank you so much. If people want to find out more about what AVID Technology does, what's the best way to find out more about your company?
So our website has got a lot of information on it. We do a lot of video content as well, which is all linked from the website. And then as we talked about earlier, we've got our own podcast now as well.
What's that called and how do we find it?
So if you looked for the AVID Electric Vehicle Podcast on any of the normal, on iTunes, or there seems to be a zillion different podcast channels, you'll find us. It's basically we seem to be the only people doing a technology-led electric vehicle podcast.
AVID Electric Vehicle Podcast. Make sure you go and search for that. It'll show up in all the different various places, of course, on iTunes and those kind of things. And we look forward to hearing your next few installments. If you want to go online, it's avidtp.com. That's avidtp.com. Ryan, thank you so much for your time today, and I hope maybe in the future we can catch up again somewhere down the line and kind of look about what we talked about and see which predictions came true and what we were off on, and then reappraise at some point.
That would be great. Yeah, fantastic, Martyn. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, once again, my sincere thanks to Ryan and everyone at AVID for making the interview happen. I hope you've learned a couple of things today. We'd like to do a little bit more of this, if possible. Just take you behind the scenes of maybe companies you may or may not have heard of, actually, and everybody that is involved in this transition towards electrified transports. In the meantime, the news will be back tomorrow. And for now, there's 193 previous episodes to listen to on all the usual places, plus the blog at evnewsdaily.com. If you subscribe, you get them first and free and automatically. And if you can possibly share this podcast with maybe somebody or more than one person who you can think of now who might be interested in this, it would mean the world to me. Over the weekend, if you want to catch up on the socials, search EV News Daily. Have a wonderful day. I'll catch you tomorrow.